Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Kirsten. We have been covering the inner spiritual disciplines that have an inward focus. We've covered meditation, right? The slowing down of the heart and creating intentional space for God by listening. Then we moved on to the communication piece with prayer, and we have gotten to the next step, which is our action step of fasting. Ooh, Christians love to just not acknowledge fasting, or there's a lot of misconceptions about it. This is probably the spiritual discipline that I struggle with the most, still struggle with, and it presents a lot of difficulties. Why does it present a lot of difficulties? Well, with the other two disciplines, we had to ask the question, how, right? We kind of knew the ideas, but we had to learn how to do them. The opposite is true with fasting. We know how to give things up, right? You just simply don't do them. But the better question is why, right? And if we're answering the question on why, this is not going to be a video on how to food fast, right? There's a lot of science on how to eliminate food well and how to not have medical side effects from that. Just knowing that there are medical side effects from fasting proves that we have come a long way. But because of that, a lot of people are barred from fasting, right? Diabetics, for example, they really need to control what's going in and out of their body. We also understand there's a lot of people with medical and mental health issues related to food. And so does this mean that they can't fast? No. When we look at the history of fasting, in first century Rome, they didn't have a lot, right? Society was pretty simple, right? You would get up, you'd go to work, and really the only thing to give up was food. So obviously in the Bible, food is going to be the thing to give up. In the 21st century, however, society is a lot more complex. We have a lot more things to give up, and we have to take a different relationship with fasting. So, where to begin, right? Because we've already kind of changed the narrative. Well, as always, let's start in the Bible. So people have been fasting since all the way back in the Old Testament, right? And that's kind of where it's most famously depicted. Moses had his 40-day long fast, and Daniel has his fast, which people tend to hyper-focus on those kinds of fasts of how they did it. Like the Daniel diet. People love to focus on the specifics, but then we miss the point of fasting. Fasting is not how you do it, it's why you do it, right? Fasting is not simply giving something up. You heard me right. It's not simply giving it up. We have missed in the Bible that it's not just giving something up. And a lot of people get hung up on that. They think it's just something that they're giving up. Another misconception is a lot of people get this guilt because they don't fast and they say, like, God told me I have to fast. Nowhere in the Bible does Jesus tell you have to fast. Nowhere. He never commands it. He never makes it a law. He never makes it something that you have to do. But people then say, well, Kirsten, Jesus said when you fast. That's not a command. That's an expectation, right? And so people make it a command, but it's not. So when Jesus was saying when you fast, right, he was putting the expectation on that it's something that we should do, but, it isn't required. I think of fasting like giving, right? The Bible in the New Testament, Paul even tells you shouldn't give out of a negative heart, right? Which, sorry, church leaders, right? You're not required to give, and Paul actually says if you're giving out of the wrong kind of attitude, God can actually get mad about that. The same is with fasting. We have to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves with fasting. The idea is the heart and intent of fasting. If we don't know why we're fasting, then we won't enjoy fasting, right? If we don't know why we're giving to the church, then we're not going to want to give to the church. So just like giving, right, you give back to the church because you have been invested in, right? The church has done something for you. So you want to give to the church because you want to support ministries, you want to help missionaries go and do things. and because God has put it on your heart that you should give, right? That's why every year churches do their big push to recognize, like, God has called you to do this. It's not commanded, but it's a growth step, right? New Christians on day one are not going to be like, all my money to the church, right? It's a growth step. Fasting is a growth step that comes out of a strong prayer life. You're not going to feel, and I'm not going to say, when I say never, or you're not going to, God can do whatever he wants to do. But most people are not going to feel called to fasting on day one, right? It comes out of learning to spend time with God and pray with God. And I know a lot of Christians that never get to that fasting point, and they never really feel called to it, and then they feel guilty about it. Fasting is a growth point out of prayer. God will call you to fasting. He will put something in front of you and will say, like, hey, wake up a little bit, right? So maybe you have a problem in front of you, or you have a big decision. And just like how with giving, somebody has invested in you and you want to give back, God has given you this relationship and all these insights in your prayer life. And so you recognize out of a growth point, like, God, I have to pick what university I'm going to. I have to pick, like, my job. I have these two options in front of me. And I recognize that I'm broken, that I don't know what I'm doing. But I recognize that you do. And so I want to intentionally set these things aside that I put before you and spend time with you instead, right? So like with eating, instead of having a meal, God, I'm going to spend time in prayer, right? Or instead of watching TikToks, I'm going to spend time in prayer, right? It's a really important two-step process. It's not just giving something up. That's kind of why Lent drives me crazy, right? Is because it's not just giving something up. It needs to be so that you're spending time with God, right? You spend intentional prayer time with God, right? So I'm going to give up playing video games, but instead of playing video games, I'm going to pray about this specific issue, right? It's a relationship investment. Just like how you want to spend time with your significant other, and so you give up, your Saturday morning in your PJs to go spend time with your significant other, it's the same way with God, right? It needs to be something that we want to do, not something that we're doing out of an obligation. And this is why I think things like giving up social media or time on your phone or time on electronics is a much more approachable way to fast in the 21st century, other than food, because it's something that we actually value a lot more. And I think it kind of requires more of a sacrifice from us, especially on the long term, because not only are we sacrificing our technology, but that's like our relationship base, right? So it's a really big investment with God. And so fasting becomes complicated if you don't have your heart in the right place. A lot of people will fast to get a reward out of God, right? God, I really want to do well on this test, or God, I really want this thing, so I'm going to fast about it. And that's the wrong kind of attitude to come out of fasting. It should be this like quiet, intimate moment between you and your Father saying, God, I have this concern. I have this misunderstanding, and I know that I'm not doing as much as I can, so I want your help, right? Fasting should be a really humble attitude, and that's why I don't, fasting should be approached lightly, but never in a guilty, right? If you're doing it out of guilt, then you shouldn't be doing it at all. But it's this humble attitude, not a give me attitude. And that's why fasting is a difficult spiritual discipline, right? Because it comes with a lot of misunderstandings, and it requires a lot on our part. It's one thing to sit in a room and be quiet and listen, and it's another thing to pray as you go about your day, but it's a whole other thing to really give something up. But there's so much power that comes out of fasting. Urban Impact does this great thing where at the start of their season, they do an organization-wide fast. And it's not out of an attitude of, we're going to flaunt this thing. I just know about it because I have a lot of friends at Urban Impact. But it's, God, we recognize that we can't do this without you. God, we recognize we're tackling a big thing. So we're going to spend time with you and invest in our relationship with you before we invest in our relationship with these kids. That's huge. That's a big humbling step. And they don't do like an easy fast either. I hear about it. I'm like, whew. So fasting gives us a reordering of our loves. Fasting comes out of, an understanding of our brokenness, right? And that's what makes fasting so hard. It comes out of an understanding of, I can't do it, so God, I need your help. It's a really complex issue, and it comes with a lot of misunderstandings. So I hope that this video helped a little bit. I am by no means a fasting expert, and like I said, honestly, it's one that I struggle to get my heart in tune with because I'm bad at it. And I struggle with guilt a lot of the time. But I hope that this kind of shifted your orientation towards fasting, that it's not an obligation, it's not something that like high and mighty Christians do, but it's something that God will put on your heart when you have this big issue, right? It'll come to a point where you want to invest back in your relationship with God and really, really be meaningful about spending time with Him, right? It's kind of a celebration or a culmination of like, God, I don't have it all together. I have this big thing. And fasting doesn't have to be just about a big issue, right? It can be about something like, God, this person is really sick and I want to focus on that. I want to really focus on prayer for this person. So every time I think about giving up I think about my cell phone, then I go, oh yeah, I need to pray for that person. Or every time, I want to go scroll mindlessly through that app, oh yeah, I'm actually going to pray instead. Gives us a very physical reminder of prayer. So tomorrow I'm going to post some science on how to fast with food, because it is, there's a lot of medical things. I, for one, really struggle with fasting with food. I get really dizzy. I get headaches. I'm like extremely prone to those kinds of things. So fasting with food never really works well for me. And there's a lot of people with medical issues and stuff. So get out of the fasting box, right? Give it a try, but do it from the right heart place, right? Don't do it because you feel like you have to. That's my piece on fasting, right? It's kind of a difficult thing to cover in 13 minutes. But I hope that it gave you something and that God kind of moves you through this. If you have any questions, let me know. Share some fasting tips you have below, or what has and hasn't worked for you. Or share your fasting celebrations with me. I'd love to hear them and how fasting has helped you. As always, I will see you next Thursday with our next episode of Coffee with Kirsten. Thanks, guys.